Do the crime. Do the time. These days, it's quite straightforward to understand what your fate would be if you got caught committing a crime. You'd be looking at time in prison, a fine, or community service. Back in the days of the Roman Empire, though, it was a lot more complicated than that. It depended on who you were, where you stood in Roman society, who you knew, and what you'd done. If you were a Roman citizen, you probably wouldn't be punished physically, but you'd know a whole lot of pain in a different way. According to an early Roman legal document called the 12 Tablets, there were 8 different forms of punishment: fine, fetters, flogging, retaliation in kind, civil disgrace, banishment, slavery, death. But what would you have to do to get flogged? And what did civil disgrace actually mean? The Roman Empire is a complicated state, in and of itself. As the empire grew, so did the variety of people who lived in it. A Gaul from France would have a different idea of what to do with a thief to a citizen of Rome, to a Greek expat living in Iberia. The punishments adapted and changed over the centuries, but one thing remained the same. Roman citizens had a far greater level of protection than many of the other people who lived in the empire at the same time, and social stability was valued above all. That meant that the Roman approach to crime can be summed up easily: punish and deter. Trials were held quickly, and punishment would have followed swiftly after. Some of the punishments were so ingeniously cruel that the condemned person would commit suicide rather than facing the punishment for their crime. Let's take a look at what you could expect for each crime in the Roman Empire. Welcome to the Roman Empire. Civil crimes. Theft. Getting caught for stealing in the modern world often means having to pay a fine or do community service, or perhaps going to prison if the thing stolen was valuable enough. However, Romans took a far less lenient view towards larceny, especially in the early years of the empire, where you could be flogged, enslaved, or even executed for stealing. Over time, attitudes to theft softened, and normally you'd just have to pay damages. The exception to this law was a peculiar concept called usucapion, where if you stole something and brazenly used it out in the open, you could legally claim it after a year or two. And this didn't just apply to small things like jewelry or other possessions. It could be an entire house if you weren't careful. As Romans didn't really have any record-keeping for land, it made sense to settle disputes in this way. If you claimed something for over a year and the original owner never bothered to contest the issue, then it made sense to make that thing legally yours. Roman law differentiated between possessions and property in respect to this law, though. Something that was movable became legally yours after 12 months, while you needed to claim a property for 2 years before you could legally say it belonged to you. Incendium. Setting someone else's property on fire came with severe consequences according to the 12 Tables, the legal code in the Roman Empire. If it was done intentionally, then the arsonist could face deportation, flogging, getting sentenced to physical labor, or even death. Some sources indicate that arsonists would have met a fitting end by being burned alive, but that's probably an urban myth, as we don't see any evidence of it in the Roman legal code. However, some records say that when Nero accused the Christians of starting a fire in AD 64, the punishment they faced was horrific. Many of them were sentenced to death in a truly dreadful manner, being used as torches in Nero's garden. Family crimes. Patricide. Romans cared deeply about social structure and were terrified of anything that could disrupt the somewhat precarious empire they'd built. With the father figure being of the utmost importance in Roman society, anything that threatened the power balance was treated incredibly harshly. Patricide, killing your father, or parricide, killing a close relative, was met with one of the most gruesome punishments: poena cullae. Poena cullae, or the punishment of the sack, was a horrifying way to die. While the sources sometimes disagree on the details, the general idea was that the person accused of killing their parents would be whipped before getting thrown in a large leather sack, along with a rooster, a dog, and a snake. Some sources say that a monkey was also included, but not always. Once the sack was sewn shut with everyone inside, it was then thrown into a nearby river or lake. As the sack sank below the water, the frantic animals inside would attack the person before they started to suffocate. It doesn't seem that this was a common punishment since it required a lot of effort, but the threat of it would have been enough to put a lot of people off taking any sort of revenge on their family. Stuprum. Despite what you may have heard about debauched orgies in the Roman Empire, the truth was very different. Roman society was conservative and, dare I say, even a little prudish. Sexuality was supported by religious traditions, and the idea of masculinity and femininity was reflected in their beliefs. Mixing that with the Roman dedication to the family unit and the patriarch, you might begin to see how sexual liberation was something only for men, and any sort of transgression would have been seriously frowned upon. Top among the sexual crimes would have been stuprum, or criminal debauchery, in modern terms that would cover adultery, rape, and incendium. Since adultery threatened the family unit, it was treated as a serious offense, and men often had plenty of power to deal with his cheating spouse. If a husband caught his wife in an affair, he was well within his rights to lock his wife and her lover up in a room before calling the neighborhood to come and laugh at them and heap derision on the adulterous couple. Then the jilted husband had 3 days to come up with all the juicy gossip and declare it publicly before divorcing her. If he didn't divorce her, he could be charged with pimping, a crime that carried the punishment of exile and losing your property. Incestum is where we get the word incest from, but in Roman times it meant something closer to sacrilege, or any act that violated religious purity. When a man dressed as a woman and took part in the sacred rites of Bona Dea, which is reserved only for women, he was charged with incestum and sentenced to death. Plagium. Kidnapping or plagium, the knowing detention of a Roman citizen or slave against their will, was a serious crime that was dealt with in the civil courts. However, despite the severity, it was normally settled by paying a fine. But at other times throughout the Roman Empire, the punishment was much harsher. In the early 3rd century, Emperor Constantine enacted a law that meant that anyone who kidnapped children for ransom would have been thrown to the beasts or beheaded. Damnatio ad metallum. These days, Spain is a popular tourist destination known for beautiful sandy beaches, a mild climate, and stunning architecture. However, to a Roman citizen, the idea of getting sent to Spain would have been terrifying. If you were a prisoner of war, or committed arson or another serious crime, you could be sent to Spain for one of the most brutal punishments, damnatio ad metallum. This punishment meant being banished to any of the mines throughout the Roman Empire. The conditions were harsh and the work was backbreaking. Criminals in the mines were shackled to stop them from escaping and put to work underground, hauling raw minerals from deep within the earth. Workers often died due to poor ventilation and cave-ins, while being forced to work brutally long hours with minimal food or rest. Crimes against the empire. Being a Christian. Simply following the Christian faith was enough to get you sentenced to one of the most severe and famous punishments throughout all of history, damnatio ad bestias. Being a practicing Christian meant breaking a number of Roman laws, including treason, sacrilege, and gathering in an unlawful way, hence the brutal punishment that they faced. Damnatio ad bestias was a capital punishment and entertainment rolled into one, as the condemned Christian was forced into an arena with a number of wild animals. The animals were usually lions or other big cats, but it could also have been crocodiles or other wild animals. Getting sent to fight wild animals was a horrifying way to meet your end, as the condemned people would often be forced into the arena with no weapons or way to defend themselves. At other times, the condemned would be tied to a post as the animals were let in. And it's not just the painful nature of damnatio ad bestias that made it such an extreme punishment. Getting sentenced to death in this way would deny you a proper burial, which was a ceremony of great importance in Roman society. Treason. Treason, as we call it today, wasn't a concept for the Romans, but they did have another word for crimes against the Roman people, majestas. The idea behind this legal term is any offense that would reflect negatively on the majesty of the Roman people and encompass the full spectrum from plotting against the state to acting in such a way that brought the honor of the Roman people into disrepute. The most serious form of majestas was injured majesty, or laesa majestas, where the emperor himself was the target of the crime. With such a serious target, the punishment was equally weighty. In one case, this meant a banishment where the perpetrator was forbidden from living near or using fire and water, which were thought to be the basic elements of life. In reality, this would have been impossible to enforce and simply meant that the person was exiled from the Roman Empire. Exile was a harsh enough punishment in its own right, as Roman citizens had a lot of legal and social advantages and protection. Getting exiled meant losing all protection and being forced to start over in a foreign country with no support or allies to rely on. In the earlier years of the empire, non-citizens faced a much more severe punishment for treason crucis supplicium, or crucifixion. If a slave started a revolt, the empire would quash the uprising by crucifying as many of the participants as possible, including the notorious slave army led by Spartacus. After the consul gained control, 6,000 slaves were crucified. Being a Roman citizen brought many benefits, but also meant you had to follow a strict set of rules. 1 foot stepped out of line could lead down a dangerous road to execution, brutal physical punishments, and getting stripped of all your rights and privileges. The Romans took a dim view on anything that threatened their standard way of life, and so took swift action to make sure that any and all transgressions were a one-time thing. Punishments were painful and public spectacles designed to keep the citizens in line and obeying the letter of the law.